How can you ensure secure access to Azure Storage resources using Shared Access Signatures (SAS) while limiting the IP addresses that can access them? You can configure Shared Access Signatures (SAS) with IP address restrictions to limit access to Azure Storage resources only from specific IP ranges. This enhances security by allowing access only from trusted sources. Explain how to configure Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle Management policies to automatically delete blobs older than a certain date. Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle Management policies can be configured with rules that specify deletion of blobs based on their creation date. This allows you to automate the process of removing old data that is no longer needed. How can you implement tiered storage for Azure Virtual Machine Disks using Azure Blob Storage? You can implement tiered storage for Azure Virtual Machine Disks by using Azure Blob Storage's hot, cool, and archive access tiers. Different tiers offer varying costs and performance levels, allowing you to optimize storage for your virtual machines. Explain how Azure Blob Storage's versioning feature can be used for data protection and recovery. Azure Blob Storage's versioning feature allows you to maintain multiple versions of a blob over time. This can be used for data protection and recovery by allowing you to restore a previous version of a blob in case of accidental changes or deletions. How can you implement a hierarchical file system for Azure Blob Storage using Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2? Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 provides a hierarchical file system that allows you to organize files and directories similarly to a traditional file system. This enhances data organization, access control, and analytics capabilities for large datasets. Explain the concept of snapshot chains in Azure Blob Storage and how they relate to data versioning. Snapshot chains are sequences of snapshots of the same blob in Azure Blob Storage. Each snapshot captures the state of the blob at a specific point in time, enabling you to maintain a historical record of changes and versions. How can you enforce data retention policies using blob versioning and immutability policies in Azure Blob Storage? You can use blob versioning to maintain historical versions of blobs and immutability policies to prevent modification or deletion of blobs for a specified period. These features help enforce data retention policies and protect data from unauthorized changes. Explain how Azure Storage's static website hosting feature can be used to host and serve static websites. Azure Storage's static website hosting feature allows you to store and serve static web content directly from a storage container. By configuring the container for static website hosting, you can create cost-effective and scalable web hosting solutions. How can you optimize data retrieval performance from Azure Blob Storage using Azure Content Delivery Network (CDN)? Azure Content Delivery Network (CDN) can be used to cache and deliver blob content from edge locations, reducing latency and improving data retrieval performance. This is particularly useful for globally distributed users accessing the same content. Explain the concept of soft delete for blobs in Azure Storage and its benefits. Soft delete for blobs retains deleted blobs for a specified retention period, allowing you to recover accidentally deleted data during that window. This provides a safety net against data loss due to unintended deletions. How can you use Azure Monitor and Azure Alerts to proactively monitor and manage the performance and health of Azure Storage resources? Azure Monitor allows you to set up metrics and alerts to monitor the performance and health of Azure Storage resources. By configuring alerts based on predefined conditions, you can receive notifications and take proactive actions to address issues. Explain the advantages of using Azure Storage Queues for building asynchronous messaging-based applications. Azure Storage Queues provide a simple and cost-effective way to build asynchronous messaging-based applications. They enable decoupling of components, handle load spikes, and ensure reliable message delivery for improved application scalability and resilience. How can you implement data encryption in transit for Azure Storage resources using Azure Private Link Azure Private Link allows you to access Azure Storage resources over a private connection. By using Private Link, data sent between your network and Azure Storage is encrypted in transit, ensuring data security and privacy. Explain how to implement data tiering and archiving for Azure Blob Storage using Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle Management Policies. Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle Management Policies allow you to automate the transition of data between different access tiers, such as hot, cool, and archive. By defining rules based on access patterns, you can optimize storage costs while maintaining data accessibility. How can you implement content delivery and acceleration for Azure Blob Storage using Azure Content Delivery Network, CDN? Azure Content Delivery Network, CDN, can be configured to deliver content from Azure Blob Storage to edge locations worldwide. By caching content at these locations, you improve content delivery speed and reduce latency for end users. Explain the concept of page blobs and their use cases in Azure Blob Storage. Page blobs are optimized for random read and write operations, making them suitable for scenarios that require disk-level access, such as virtual machine disks and database storage. They provide efficient handling of large datasets at the page level. How can you implement access control and authorization for Azure Blob Storage using Shared Access Signature, SAS, tokens, and stored access policies? Stored access policies in Azure Blob Storage allow you to manage and apply predefined sets of permissions for Shared Access Signature, SAS, tokens. This enhances security by enforcing consistent access rules and minimizing the risk of misconfigurations. Explain how GeoZone Redundant Storage, G0S, enhances data durability and availability in Azure Blob Storage. GeoZone Redundant Storage, G0S, replicates data across availability zones within a region and also keeps a secondary copy in a secondary region. This ensures data durability and availability even during regional failures or outages. How can you enable secure data transfer to Azure Blob Storage using Shared Access Signature, SAS, tokens with time-bound access? Shared Access Signature, SAS, tokens with time-bound access provide temporary and restricted access to Azure Blob Storage resources. By setting an expiration time on the SAS token, you control how long the access is valid, enhancing security. Explain how Azure Storage Explorer can be used for managing and interacting with Azure Storage resources. Azure Storage Explorer is a graphical user interface tool that allows you to manage, upload, download, and organize Azure Storage resources. It provides an intuitive way to work with storage accounts, containers, blobs, queues, and tables. How can you enable secure access to Azure Storage resources from a virtual network using service endpoints? Service endpoints allow you to secure access to Azure Storage resources by extending your virtual network's private address space to Azure services. This ensures that data traffic between your virtual network and storage resources remains within the Azure network. Explain how to use Azure Blob Storage triggers and Azure Functions for automating tasks based on blob-related events. Azure Blob Storage triggers and Azure Functions allow you to create serverless workflows that are triggered by blob-related events, such as new blob creations or modifications. You can automate actions like data processing, notifications, or integrations based on these events. How can you enable secure data access to Azure Storage resources using Azure AD Authentication and Role-Based Access Control, RBC? Azure AD Authentication allows you to use Azure AD credentials to access Azure Storage resources. By using Role-Based Access Control, RBC, you can assign specific roles and permissions to users and groups, controlling their access to storage resources. Explain how Azure Blob Storage's append blobs can be used for scenarios involving data streams and sequential write operations. Append blobs are designed for scenarios that involve data streams and sequential write operations. They allow you to append data to the end of the blob, making them suitable for use cases like logging, auditing, and data ingestion. How can you enable secure access to Azure Storage resources from an on-premises network using Azure ExpressRoute? Azure ExpressRoute allows you to establish a dedicated private connection between your on-premises network and Azure. This secure connection ensures that data traffic between your network and Azure Storage resources remains isolated from the public internet. Explain how to implement cross-account data replication using Azure Data Factory for efficient data movement between Azure Blob storage accounts. Azure Data Factory can be used to create data pipelines that move data between Azure Blob storage accounts. By configuring source and destination settings, you enable efficient cross-account data replication and synchronization. How can you ensure secure and authorized access to Azure Storage resources using Shared Access Signature (SAS) tokens with specific permissions and constraints? Shared Access Signature (SAS) tokens allow you to grant fine-grained access to Azure Storage resources. By defining specific permissions, constraints, start and expiry times, and IP restrictions, you control the scope and duration of access. Explain how Azure Blob Storage's snapshot feature can be used for data versioning and point-in-time recovery. Snapshots in Azure Blob Storage capture the state of a blob at a specific point in time. They can be used for data versioning, point-in-time recovery, and preserving historical data states, ensuring data integrity and availability. How can you implement secure data transfer from on-premises environments to Azure Blob Storage using Azure DataBox? Azure DataBox is a physical data transfer appliance that you can use to securely transfer large amounts of data from on-premises environments to Azure Blob Storage. You load your data onto the device, ship it to Microsoft, and the data is ingested into your storage account. Explain how to implement data archiving for Azure Table Storage using Table Entity Expiry settings. Azure Table Storage allows you to set Table Entity Expiry settings which automatically delete entities after a specified period. This feature helps implement data archiving and retention policies, ensuring that outdated data is removed from the table.
Hey, if you like the content, please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a bite of Azure brilliance.